Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Beyer. I'm the founder of Female Disruptors, and we are about to start our first keynote of the day. If you are here live with us, thank you for joining. If you are watching the replays, which I think a lot of you will be doing, hi, whatever order you're doing this in. I'm honored to have you and grateful to bring this content to you. So a little bit about our guest, our keynote, Sherry Walling. I met Sherry through a mutual group that we're in, and it was perfect timing. Sherry is a trauma psychologist. She just came out with a book over the summer called Touching Two Worlds that focuses on grief and loss. And it's she also did a TED Talk that describes the grief that immobilized her after the deaths of her father and her brother. So I'm very interested in Sherry being a guest because it seems like the word trauma has been trending over the past couple of years. And with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Sherry and say welcome and see whatever else you want to add to your TEDx talks and your famous podcasts and your books and all of your wealth of knowledge that you bring to your audience.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. It is so good to be with you. And I know so much hard work has gone into putting together this event. And I think it's something that hopefully is really an active service to the folks who are participating. So I appreciate the invitation to have this conversation. And yeah, your introduction is relatively correct. I'm a psychologist and I talk a lot about trauma and grief and really difficult, heavy things. And I do that in a lot of different kinds of communities. But one thing that, I think is interesting to mention about kind of who I am in the world is that my entry into very deep grief was sort of co-occurred with my entry into becoming an amateur circus artist. So that's a little bit of an unusual combination, but that is kind of what my TED Talk is about. And I think it's important for me, for the sort of truth about myself and how I represent myself in the world, to say I have all of these accolades and degrees and I do this really heavy and intense work, but also as a human, I love to play and move, and staying connected to those parts of myself has been really key to, I think, what I have to offer the world, and certainly the key to just my sanity and well-being as a human.
One of the things that I found super interesting about your background is that you help entrepreneurs and leaders get through difficult times. And I think, whether you call yourself an entrepreneur or not, we're all entrepreneurs of our own life. And so your book that came out, it touches on, your personal memoir of what you went through with your dad and your brother. And what, can you share with us a little insight into your book and kind of go into what you're seeing with like helping, whether it's your community or, your audience, and kind of dealing with the grief, loss, and overcoming trauma?
Yeah, so I wrote Touching Two Worlds. I mean, honestly, a little bit by accident. I had written an earlier book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together. I hope it's okay to say shit in this webinar, sorry. And that book really was a very professional book, right? It was a thoughtful, had a marketing plan. It was to build my audience and reach based on this area of new expertise relating to entrepreneur mental health and wellness. And I didn't plan to write a book about grief, even though I'd been working at the National Center for PTSD. I'd done a lot with traumatic bereavement. Like, it's certainly part of my professional wheelhouse, but it wasn't the next thing on my agenda as a business owner. But then grief happened to me. And one of the things that I found myself doing was writing about it, and was also talking about it, because that's really core to my mission in the world, is to help people have hard conversations, especially high performing people who really have even less language to talk about their grief, their pain, their lostness, their heartache. And so it just felt pretty core to who I am to start talking about it and writing about it, really as a journal, right? It's just sort of my personal life. But I talked about it so much and wrote about it so much, then I felt like, oh, this is something that I really feel called to share and to talk about these stories in a deeper way. Mostly because I think grief and trauma get kind of relegated. Like, keep that quiet. Don't bring that to work. Don't bring that to your professional, high achieving life. Those are things you overcome, and don't let yourself show that vulnerability to the world around you. And I just didn't believe that. And so I wanted to do it a little bit differently. So I wrote the book, had the opportunity to shop it to a publisher. They were very wary. I mean, basically, a lot of people who experience grief write about it, and it's a wonderful way to process grief. But it was, I sort of kept hearing this line of like, grief books don't sell. Like, we already have our grief book, the publishers would say. But eventually was able to connect with Sounds True, which is really a wonderful, wonderful publisher for this work, because it's a publisher that really is interested in the intersection of science and spirituality, which is kind of my jam, right? How do we bring together these different parts of our lives into a place where we can combine them thoughtfully and just in dialogue? So that's where my book found a home. And it came out last July and has been a kind of a wild ride. I think it's unique to have a book that is a very personal book from a professional. So it's a little bit like the cancer specialist who gets a weird cancer or rare cancer, or the autism advocate who has a child with autism. Like, the things go together in a way that we can see into this world, both through my eyes as a professional and through my eyes as a daughter and a sister and a human.
I read your book. Actually, I listened to your book too. So it's really weird right now hearing your voice, because you actually, like, you did the audio on your book and it was so good. And it's a heavy topic, but you made some light of it, and made it, also very actionable. So you don't have to necessarily be the one going through the grief for it to be relevant, which I thought was very good. It really showed you how to handle and communicate with others that are going through some sort of grief or loss. And that part I thought was very valuable. But I love the part also how I think it was like one of the earlier chapters, and you're talking about how, okay, you're used to giving advice to your patients when they're going through this, like, I think it was shock or something. You ask 3 questions, something like that. And I just thought that was, it really gives so much depth to now you helping others, because you're actually, like you said, going through this like severe grief and loss and traumatic experience yourself. And, you're walking the walk and talking the talk.
Yeah, I think the part you're referencing in a real psychiatric crisis, or where we're unsure if someone is really oriented to like who they are. Well, we ask these like really basic questions, like, where are you? What day is it? What's your name? These like that, we got the orientation questions. And you don't ask them like every day with your therapy patients, but you ask them in a crisis time. And so I found myself asking myself those questions quite a lot. I'd be walking through Target and just have this sense of like, I am in Target to buy sheets for the bed where my father will die in the next week. And so to like find myself in a situation and need to ground into my own orientation, like, my name is Sherry. I am Tim's daughter. I am in Target. This is what I'm doing. I think I was really impacted by what it feels, from my patients to be in those moments of feeling like they're spinning and completely disoriented and completely untethered from a life that felt familiar and safe and accessible, maybe just a week before, right? Some of these changes happened so fast in our lives. And so our capacity to kind of recalibrate how to get our feet on the ground and get our wits about us is, it's kind of a superpower, actually.
And I love your TED talk of how you joined the circus as an outlet to overcome your grief and loss. And I'm paraphrasing. Can you share that with us? Because we hear all the time, oh, find an outlet, journal, listen to music, read, and if you could just share the impact of when you find that outlet and how you found it and what that does for you or for others.
So I think having an outlet for grief, for any kind of big emotion, I guess I also just want to mention grief isn't only an emotional reaction to death. Grief comes up with lots of things, with a job transition, with a kid going to college. There are all kinds of parts of our lives, sometimes even positive things that have grief to them. So, obviously my work focuses on death because that's the material I had to work with, but it's certainly not the only time when these kinds of strategies become really helpful. So in terms of an outlet, there are, of course, lots of outlets, and you mentioned some wonderful ones. Being able to journal, to write, to express what's happening inside. But the thing that I really honed in on, and the focus of my TED Talk is really about the importance of movement as an outlet. Our bodies in general in our culture we sit still way too much. We stare at these little screens. So we don't have much big movement in our lives. And movement in particular is really, really helpful for traumatic shock or big grief, because those physiological reactions to those big experiences kind of slam into our bodies, and they leave a significant imprint in how our brains function. It's almost like they get logged as these like big, what do we call them? We call them flashbulb memories, like these big events, and they sort of cause it's like a lightning strike to an electric box. It causes this surge in our sort of systems. And when we try to cope with a reaction to that, it is a physiological coping. And so that's where movement is really important. Like, we're resetting our systems, we're resetting our brain's biochemistry, we're resetting the way that our nervous system relates to our muscles. Like, we're just sort of like doing a hardcore reset. And movement is, I think, one of the only ways to really get at the physiological aspects of a shock and trauma. And so for me, I just sort of accidentally happened upon a yoga studio that had an aerial class. And I've been a long time yoga practitioner and yoga teacher. And so, I love yoga. But then there was this whole like yoga on the ceiling thing. And I was like, this is cool. I could get into this. But it wasn't until this deep grief that I felt like I kind of needed it in order to breathe. And the big movement is powerful. I think for me, some of the risk taking is powerful, being up really high. It means that my whole mind, body, attention is all focused on what I'm doing as an aerialist. So I do flying trapeze and I do the aerial silk. So there are things that they're fairly risky. You can't be like thinking about something else or having an emotional moment and training on that apparatus. Like, you need to be really focused. And when you're in trauma and grief, there's such an inertia to think about it, to dwell on it, to deal with it, to remember it. And it's only through some huge engagement of our minds and bodies that we get these little pockets of respite, that we get a little break from the trauma and grief, because now we're thinking about our next trapeze trick, or we're listening to what our coach is saying. So it's emotional processing, it's moving through, it's actually healing the brain and the chemistry of the body. And it's a really sort of healthy, lovely little distraction too. And the one other thing that I'll mention that I really love about doing a deep dive into a physical activity in reaction to trauma and grief is then there's this whole like little community of people. So I now have all of these circus friends who they're not in the weeds with me about my sad family story. They kind of may be peripherally aware of it, but that's not the point of our relationship. But we have this thing that we do together, and I see them regularly, and it creates this sense of community and belonging that's not involving this really hard, heavy part of my life. And so there's another place where it's just a little bit of a break for the system.
Nice. Just switching gears to focus on women and trauma and burnout. And, even before the pandemic, my first kind of like, I guess, experience with like, am I close to burnout, was I was on the phone with my therapist, and I'm like, I'm just feeling like I'm burning the candle at both ends. And my therapist was like, well, Lisa, from burning the candle at both ends, that leads to depression. So when you're highly stressed out, the next step is depression. And that was kind of like the first light bulb. But I feel like women, I was like, what? I'm not depressed. Like, that's impossible.
Mm.
I'm just going, I'm compartmentalizing, and I'm, trying to, multitask and just get shit done. And I think that's just comes natural with women. And I think that in my experience, that has led to, my experience of burnout and closer depression. So what can women do? Women have the much higher statistic of burnout and trauma than men. So what can women do today? What advice do you give to women to deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, it sounds super cheesy, but for women to take care of themselves. And I I think we don't, because we have all kinds of loading to not do that. And so it's very easy for us to defer to the needs of our kids, of our employees, of our team members, of our friends, and be kind of this constantly available vessel to help and to be supportive and to show up. And, within reason, I think we as women probably need to get much more adept at being strategically selfish and of carving out true time for the things that really recharge us. Probably not wine and Netflix. That's a nice like rest, but it doesn't really recharge. And so, I would also sort of go back to my life in the circus and a deep dedication to play and a deep dedication to really, in many ways, build my life around something that is absolutely life-giving. And I think a lot of people don't do that. Like we're really in our heads about our adult responsibility, and I think tell ourselves a story about how life has to be that doesn't really serve us.
Do you have some signs of burnout that women should be mindful of watching and know that this is something that they need to be aware of?
Yeah, burnout is a term that gets tossed around a lot, but I think it's important for people to know, like it's actually a formal diagnosis. It exists in the ICD-10, which is the International Classification of Disorders, and it has its own code. It exists as something that your doctor can diagnose you with, and it formally has three criteria. The first is physical and emotional exhaustion, and that's probably what most people think of when they think of burnout. But women like us, if I could say, like we're kind of like the Energizer Bunny. Like we're going to go, go, go until we just like flop over. So I think some of the ways that this particular thing shows up very practically in women is the emotional exhaustion, I think, shows up as the cold that just doesn't ever really go away. Like that lingering cough for 3 months probably means that your immune system is exhausted and not effectively fighting off an illness. And so that can be an interesting sort of cue for exhaustion. Certainly not sleeping well, or feeling like you need increased medical or chemical support to sleep is a sign of physical exhaustion. So physical and emotional exhaustion is our first sort of component of burnout. The second one is cynicism and detachment. And this is where our hearts start to get hard. We're not soft anymore. Another term that we kind of use in this realm is compassion fatigue. We are just not able to find that tenderness. We feel like we want to withdraw from other people because every conversation is kind of a pain, or it brings more trouble to us, or it's more work for us. Maybe we find ourselves kind of making fun of our clients or our colleagues or our kids. Like we're not kind. We harden and we're angry and we're protective and we're sort of edging toward a little bit of bitterness. And then the third component of burnout is a diminished sense of personal efficacy, which basically means that there's a filter over our brains that everything that we do professionally, we perceive negatively. It doesn't matter how many awards that we've won or books that we've sold or clients we've gotten or whatever it is that we're chasing. despite any objective evidence, it feels like it's just not enough. Like we're constantly pushing the boulder up the hill. We're unable to celebrate or even really realize successes. So that the three things together, right? You're tired, you don't care anymore, and it feels like it's for no good reason or it's pointless. That's the trifecta of what we talk about when we use the word burnout. And it looks a little bit different for everybody, but it is almost, by definition, it's based in some ways on our professional or our caretaking responsibilities.
And what prescription do you give for that? So, I mean, I feel like I've experienced it. What I did for myself is I kind of took a step back from like my business and, my life responsibilities. I went away for 20 days to Canyon Ranch. I came back like, oh, I'm like so much
I'm
better.
back.
I'm back. But it really, like, that was a couple years ago now. In retrospect, like it took me a good year plus, until I really kind of started feeling like myself, my old self again. And I have a friend who, financial issues, kids, college, keeping up with the Joneses, have their own business. Like there's no, according to her, like there's nothing she can do about it. But like she's like the epitome of burnout. Like, what do you tell somebody that thinks that there's nothing else they can do because they have no choice, or they have to do things the way they've been doing? It just seems like some people, it's it's self-sabotage. They don't see how they can get out of it.
Yeah. And I just want to acknowledge those situations are really hard because you can see that someone is living like a 15% version of their life.
Right. Yeah.
And feel for them. But until they see that for themselves, like it's very difficult to motivate people to take radical healing action when they aren't motivated or when they're sort of trapped in their sense of belief. So what is really interesting about burnout, it is, sounds a little dramatic to say it this way, but it's actually pretty scientifically accurate. Burnout is actually evolving brain damage, because we're essentially overusing certain circuitry in the brain. It's kind of like a repetitive stress injury for our neurology. And when it goes on for a long period of time, we actually see the neurons that connect the amygdala, which is the sort of stress center in our brain, the negative affect center in our brain. The circuitry that connects the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex begins to atrophy or decay. So it makes it much more difficult for us to talk ourselves down from negative feelings. And so the cycle it just like goes, and it gets increasingly solidified in the cells of our brain, which is why what you did with just a hard reset is what almost always needs to happen for someone who is solidly in burnout and has been in burnout for a long time. It's exactly like a physical injury. Like you have to stop doing the thing that's giving you the energy or the injury, step back and let those cells heal.
Yeah.
And nobody likes to hear that, but that's the truth.
Yeah. Another term is running on empty,
Yeah.
just like you're running on fumes and there's nothing left.
There is, I mean, we don't have to linger here too long, but there certainly are really good things that we can do to prevent burnout. And part of that is knowing what causes burnout. And just to rattle off a few things, some of the drivers of burnout are really feeling isolated, not taking care of your core relationships at work and personally. That's going to leave you feeling exhausted. Having a gap between the activities that you spend your time on and what's most meaningful to you. So basically being out of alignment is a huge driver of burnout. So sometimes we can fix that, and that makes the burnout much better without having to take a big, long sabbatical. Another driver of burnout, of course, is just having too much to do, not celebrating wins. I think this is a common thing for women. We just sort of charge through and we accomplish something and they're okay, like, what's next? Now I got to do this. Now I got to do that. So pausing, celebrating the wins, really letting ourselves enjoy the benefits of something that's been successfully completed. So it's not just like work yourself into a burnout frenzy and take 6 weeks off. It's more nuanced. There's more that we can do to prevent burnout from getting that bad and from preventing it from happening in the first place.
I love that. Thank you for those tips. So we're here, at the Female Disruptors Virtual Summit and talking about disrupting, and disrupting can also be, negative and positive. So, like last year I did this exercise where you had to come up with like the positive word that describes you and then a negative word that describes your year. And like both of my words were the same word. It was disruptive and disrupted.
Ooh, yep, that sounds right.
Yeah. So what advice do you give to women who are, trying to be disruptors, but also trying to stay balanced and, balancing, it's perfect for you. Yoga is a theme throughout Female Disruptors. We started with a yoga session yesterday on Mala's
Beautiful.
meditation. We have in middle of the day today, we have Shar is talking about yoga, using yoga for leadership. And then we're ending the day with yoga nidra. So what advice do you give women how to be a disruptor in 2023 and beyond and keep your mental health in check?
Yeah. Yoga is I'm glad that that's a through line because it's such a wonderful resource in so many ways. And I think one of the things that yoga has really taught me, and that's very true in circus as well, and I think true in disruption, is that when you are in balance, when you are straining your body in any way, there's the outside or the external perception that you're still, that balance is like a thing that you have achieved, that it's static. But of course, physiologically in our bodies, there's like lots of muscles making all these like micro movements. Like we're actually in tremendous movement when we are in the stillness of balance. And I think that's my sort of lesson around disruption is I really want to disrupt the way that mental health happens in the United States. I really want to disrupt the way that we have conversations around grief. But that's not a one-line task. Those tasks have hundreds of little sublines, like hundreds of little things. Having this conversation with you, writing this book, that's a big mission. And the disruption happens in very, very small increments. And so when I feel frustrated with the fact that I've been testifying before my state legislature about a bill related to safety in sober houses, it's something around the mental health care system that it's really important for me that's changed. And it means that I've testified like 4 times and then it's in committee and then you wait, blah, blah, blah. Disruption is a long game. And it sounds dramatic. It sounds so brave. Like we're on our horse and our sword is drawn and we're charging forward and change is happening. And it sometimes sort of feels like that, but mostly there's also all of these tiny, tiny, tiny steps towards the change that we want to see. And so I would just remind people, don't ignore the tiny steps, the tiny movements that help us balance, the tiny decisions that create a different reality. Pay attention to each of those tiny things and acknowledge them, celebrate them, let them be part of your success story, knowing that that's how disruption really happens.
Yes. And I'll just add to that, being a disruptor, there's going to be setbacks and doors closed and closed and closed. And I'm sure you've had that experience with, some of what you're trying to get, the bills you're trying to get passed, where it's like roadblock, 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 and you want to give up and, just keep going. And that roadblock somehow turns into a silver lining, in my experience, at least.
Yeah.
But Sherry, let us, as we wrap this up, any last words of wisdom, and if you could share with us, a little bit more about your book, where they can, find your book, and maybe where we can follow you. And if you're your TED Talk, we'll also put in the chat. And yeah, anything else that you have up on the horizon that you want to share with us, or last words of wisdom.
Yeah, amazing. So my book is called, it's right here. It's called Touching Two Worlds. We've got the the flower growing above ground and then the roots in this sort of mucky earth below. And it's available kind of wherever books are sold. So your local bookstore on the corner, and of course, the big behemoth like Amazon. Wherever you want wherever you want to pick it up is great. And I do have a website called touchingtwoworlds.com, which is a little bit of the deeper dive into the story behind the book. I also created an original circus show about the book, which my publisher thought was the strangest idea he'd ever heard, and was like, "You're going to make a circus about grief related to suicide?" And I was like, "Yep, I'm definitely going to do that." Anyway, it came across absolutely beautifully. So if that kind of integration of ideas and artistic expression is interesting to you, there's some of that material on the website. And then I'm online as Sherry Walling. I have sherrywalling.com. I'm on Instagram as @SherryWalling, and Twitter and LinkedIn and all the places. So I'd be happy to connect with folks on those mediums. And yeah, my feeds are always this sort of really random combination of mental health and professional speaking and doing these big professional things. And then I have a series on Instagram that I call Circus Fails, where it's generally just me falling off of something. So if that mixture of heart forward depth and silliness speaks to you, it'd be lovely to connect in those places.
One last question. You mentioned that you're looking to disrupt in mental health, the future of mental health. What are you looking for? What do you want the biggest change in mental health?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic to unload here right at the end, but one of the things that I think needs to change like very soon is the availability of using psychedelic medicines in mental health care and mental health therapy. We have a very robust body of research that supports the use of a variety of psychedelic kinds of medicines, things like MDMA or psilocybin, which work much faster and in a much more thorough way to treat things like depression, PTSD, suicidality, eating disorders, OCD, addiction, as even opioid addiction. So some of them things that are most difficult to treat using our traditional methods look like there may be some like significant promise in using these tools. So we're hoping that FDA approval will happen probably at the end of this year, beginning of next year. So it's happening and it's close, but it's as you can imagine, just with the language I'm using, it's a very huge shift in how we think about these substances and how they're used in popular understanding, as well as really training up a new generation of therapists and physicians to be able to administer them safely.
Great. Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. Yeah, that's a big topic and something that is, I think would also be a big step in the mental health care department for sure. So Sherry, thank you so much for joining us as the keynote for the category Her State, mental health, wellness, and mindset. I really appreciate you. I know everybody else does. Everybody was very excited to hear your talk. So thank you so much. And thank you for being a female disruptor.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Lisa. Have a wonderful rest of your event.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you at the next session.